I will review all this. Thank you for telling me before I got even farther into this. Okay, I'm going to walk through the whole process again. I'll delete my database right from the beginning. I'm going to open up Management Studio. I want to connect to my local server and create a new database. So if you missed it the first time, or your connection died like Lindsay, you're getting a refresher. So when Management Studio opens, I want to connect to my local server. If I don't see it here, I can click the server name in my dropdown and click Browse. That'll be down at the bottom. And under the database engine, I'll see my local server. So it might be your computer name. It might just say local. Whatever your local server is, select it and click OK. The default authentication method when you install the SQL Server engine is Windows authentication. So unless you change that at startup, you just leave this authentication as local. I changed mine at startup. I use SQL Server authentication instead. So I have to sign into my local server with the username and password. And I checked remember password so I don't have to type it in each time. Then I just click connect. I'm connected to my local server instance. Down in the Object Explorer, if I expand my databases to create a new one, I just click on databases. I right click, I say new database, and I give it a name which does not contain spaces. I'm going to call it .NET Duds because that matches our web application name. Click OK, and I have a empty database running on my local server. Okay. To connect to it locally, our connection string, I'll put it in the chat again if anyone missed it. If you are connecting to a local database and using Windows authentication, you just use this connection string, but you must change the server unless your server is called local, and you have to change the database name to whatever name you called your database. So that goes in the appsettings.json file here. So you just replace the connection string that Visual Studio gave us by default with the one I've put in the chat, but make sure you update the database name. So we can see that in our data folder, we have this application DB context file. This is our database connection class, and it's managed by the Entity Framework library. Entity Framework looks after our database connections. It also maps our models to the tables in the database and also manages relationships between our models. So for example, we're going to have a relationship between categories in our store and the products in our store. That one category is going to have many products and one product is going to belong to one category. So Entity Framework is going to keep track of those relationships and model them in the database as well with relationships and foreign keys. So where does this database connection class, this application DB context, where does it get used? There's one other file, and that is we've got one other file in the project. Down at the bottom, we have a file called startup.cs. Yep, you got it, Jeffrey. So again, this is an auto-generated class. This is code that instructs how our application should run. How is it configured programmatically? So on line 28, we have a method called configure services. So all this code is auto-generated. This method gets called by the runtime. And in here, our services we are adding a DB context. We're adding a database connection using this application DB context class that's generated. So when our application starts, it's automatically going to try to connect to our database. And this method has a few parameters. It has some options defined. The default option is the type of database. We're using SQL Server. And by default, it gets the connection string called default connection. And this file is in our appsettings.json. So startup creates an instance of our database connection class using the connection string defined in appsettings.json. So that's how these three files work together. We set up the connection in our JSON file, and then our startup file instantiates our connection class when our application starts running. So all this code is pre-built for us. We don't have to do anything with it. The only thing we have to do is add our proper connection string in here. The last thing I'm going to show you is how to create a database in the Azure portal. It's not quite as simple as doing it locally, because locally we already have a server and we're already authenticated either with Windows or with a username and password. So this is the last thing we'll do today. I don't use it. I just use Entity Framework. It's the easiest thing to do. I don't actually know anything about Dapper, to be honest, Jeffrey. So when we create a database on Azure, like you need to do for your assignment, you actually first need to create a server. And along with that server, you need to create not only the database, but you need to also then create a username and password. And you need to store all those credentials in a file so you don't forget them. And then there's one other trick. So for Azure, our process looks a little different. We're going to log into the Azure portal. I'm going to go over the instructions and I'm going to walk through it, and then we'll call it a day. So about 10 more minutes will be done for today. So we go to the Azure portal. We're going to create a new SQL server there. We have to create probably a resource group, and then we have to create a server name, a database name, and a username and password. We'll want to store these credentials in a file so we don't forget them later, because we're going to need those credentials to go in here in our appsettings.json file. And then we're also going to have to configure Azure to allow remote access. By default, when you create a database on Azure, it doesn't allow remote connections. So we have to change the firewall settings in the Azure portal that will allow us to connect remotely. So I'm going to create a database. I'm not going to keep it because it's going to start using up my Azure credits. And if you don't create your database on Azure right now, that's okay. That's fine. You can follow along if you want and create it for your assignment. Or you can just refer back to these instructions in the recording later. So I'm going to log into the Azure portal at portal.azure.com. So I'm going to set up my database in Azure, and then I'm going to connect to it through Management Studio. So I'm going to click on SQL Databases and create. I'm going to create a new resource group. Like I said, again, well, the issue, Jeffrey, is with your student account, you get $100 US worth of credits. if you create your database now, but you don't start using it for a week, or if you create your database for the online store, it's going to start using those credits. And you should probably save those credits for your assignment. There's no real need to run the .NET Duds store and website on Azure. You can just run those locally because I'm not grading them. So you should save your credits for your assignment project. But I'm just showing you how you set the database up. So I create a resource group. I'm going to create a database name. And then I'm going to create a new server. So it will be called .NET Duds.database.windows.net. And I'll create and confirm a password. The location doesn't really matter. So I'm creating a database name, server admin, login, and password. You have to put these credentials in a file so you don't forget them because you're going to need them in your web application and in Management Studio. If you forget them, you have to come back to the Azure portal and reset the password. So the easiest thing, put it in a text file so you have it. So I'm going to click OK. And then this is not the cheapest storage option, so you may not need to do this, but I'm going to choose Configure My Database. It defaults to this general purpose database. I just want the basic one. So I'm going to choose the least expensive option here, the basic database. So it will use up my Azure credits as slowly as possible. And then I'm going to click Review and Create. So it's going to take a few minutes to run. Once the database is set up, I want to enter my credentials in Management Studio and try to connect to it. And then I'm probably going to delete it for today because I don't really need this database, and I'm trying to be mindful of using my Azure credits intelligently. So I wouldn't set your database up for your assignment quite yet. You can plan it out, but don't set it up yet. Probably want to set it up next week. So now what I'm going to do is go to SQL Server while this runs, and I want to try to connect to it. So under my database engine, under local server groups, I'm going to create a new server registration. So my server name will be .NET Duds.database.windows.net. Most of you used Windows Authentication locally. You can't use Windows Authentication with Azure. So you're going to need to change the authentication from Windows to SQL Server. And you have to enter the username and password you just created in the Azure portal. I'm going to click Remember Password. I'm not going to try to connect yet. It's created my server, but it's still working on creating the database inside my server. So I just need to wait until the portal tells me this is finished. It shouldn't be too long.
So wait, I'm sorry. I thought we weren't supposed to do this until next week, so I haven't really been. I've just been taking notes. We have been doing this, but
yeah, you don't have to do it now. I'm just going through and recording the process.
Okay, great.
Okay, so my database is complete. I'm going to click Go to Resource. So here's my database. So I've got my server name, my username and password, and now I'm going to try and test my connection. And it says we can't open the server because my IP address is not allowed. So there's nothing wrong with my credentials. The problem is my database by default doesn't allow remote users in. So now that my database is set up in the Azure portal, you see this button here in the middle that says Set Server Firewall. I need to click on that. And then I have a few options. If I want, I can add my current IP address. So if I click that, it adds in my IP and says this IP is allowed in. So it creates a rule down here. And if I click save, it's updating the firewall on my server. It says successful. And now if I try again, it connects. Now this works if I allow my client IP, and it works when I'm at home as long as Rogers doesn't change my IP. If I want to go and work somewhere else, I either have to allow that, I have to allow that IP address in. My alternative is just allow all IP addresses in, which is probably the easiest thing. So down here, I could also create a rule. I'll just call it all. And if I say my starting IP is all zeros, my ending IPs is all 255s, now I can go and work somewhere else. I can go to the college and work. I can go somewhere else. Well, Kevin, in a production database, you would probably restrict this. Yes. In a production database, you'd restrict it. For our purposes, it's okay. I mean, they still need the username and password to get in. So then I'll save this connection. And now it shows up here in my list of registered servers. So if I want to connect to it, if I double click it, here's my local database on my local computer. But now on Azure, here is my Azure database. So now I've got two copies of this database, one running locally and one on Azure. So again, I would recommend for your clothing store, just work on your local server. But for your assignment, that's what we're using that $100 Azure credit for. So you can create a database and run your assignment live on the internet. And your credits hopefully should be enough to get you through the semester of running the project there. So it's 1:05. I think we're going to wrap up for today. I'll stick around for a bit in case anybody has questions. So what we'll want to do next week is we want to design the models that we'll need in our clothing store. We'll create the relationships. And then we're going to use a tool called database migrations that will take our models and will automatically generate our database tables for us. We could do it manually, but it's much easier to just let Visual Studio build the database tables. So we're going to do that next week. And then we're going to scaffold controllers and views so that we have working create, read, update, and delete functionality. So next week's class is a really important one. We got the database set up, but we're going to need to connect all the pieces together and get all that functionality working in next week's class. Okay, so you're free to go for today. Have a good week. I will stop the recording and I will stick around in the WebEx room for a little bit in case anyone has questions.